Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. We are now on part 3 of our series on cultivating chastity. Links to the previous 2 parts are in the description below, so watch those first. But if you're all caught up, we're going to get right into it now. Last time, we talked about some of the church's errant responses to the sexual revolution. And at the end of that, I asserted that rather than teaching biblical sexual morality, what the church has really been teaching, for the most part, for the past few generations, is actually celibacy, which is basically abstinence, to completely refrain from sex altogether, rather than directing sexuality towards faithful, fruitful, godly marriages. And for those of us who don't have Paul's gift that he talked about in 1 Corinthians, that is a terrible strategy when it comes to our sexuality. And this time, we are going to unpack that charge of celibacy a little bit and explain why the church was teaching that rather than biblical sexual morality. Because it's not just a matter of erroneous teachings, it's also a matter of erroneous priorities. We have certain priorities which we've adopted which motivate those teachings, and those priorities are just as off base. The modern church is very much guilty of worldliness on the matter of sexuality. We accept as given the priorities of our sinful culture, and then we try to Christianize them. We try to trim at the fringes a little bit to make them godly. But when it comes to this subject, at least, our culture is way too far gone for that to be a valid strategy. There are times and places you could have lived where you would follow the general sexual morality of that culture, and it would parallel biblical sexuality to a certain extent, at least. There haven't been that many truly chaste cultures out there, but most of them are at least sensible. And ours is not. Ours is much further gone than that. And this time, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that's the case. Whatever specific reasons we give for the teachings that we have been going through. When it comes to fornication, most of what the church says is a matter of, well, you need to wait until marriage, and until then, don't have sex. And that's basically it. Our message really begins and ends there on the matter of sexuality. And yeah, some subcultures may add a few customs to that as well, I'm thinking purity culture here. But for the most part, it is just a matter of go about your business as usual, pursue the same things everybody else is pursuing, have the same priorities everybody else has, and just don't have sex while you're going about them. But the thing is, sex does not just happen. Every culture, and that includes our own, every culture has customs and it has conventions when it comes to leading people to couple, to pair up, because most people want to pair up. And for the last generation or so, middle-class American culture has given 2 major imperatives to the younger generations when it comes to organizing their lives in this way. The first is do not get married until you are established in a career. And of course, if we're talking middle-class America here, we are talking about, well, it's a good career, quote-unquote, a good career. You've got to have a college education. It's got to be that kind of career. You've got to at least get a bachelor's degree, maybe even graduate work these days. And then you have to go get a job that's in line with what you studied and that has strong career potential, and then get established in that. And then, once you finally got your education and career all settled, then you finally start thinking about marriage. That's what we've been teaching our kids for a long time now. Which, put simply, that means don't get married until you're 30. Because it takes a long time to get through all of those steps. And that is the median age for marriage now, by the way. It's 30, which is crazy because you go back only 40 years and the median age for marriage was 22. That is a major change to have happened in just a single generation. That's a seismic shift in the way that marriage is treated in our society. But that has been what we've been teaching younger generations for a while now. Don't get married until you are ready, which means educated, your career is settled. Then you can finally start looking at getting married. And that leads us to the second imperative. Well, what do you do with yourself during this really, really long wait while you're waiting to be ready to get married? And, well, during that, what we've been told is that a person should date. And what does that mean? Well, to put it bluntly, it means that you spend copious amounts of time alone with members of the opposite sex whom you have selected primarily on the basis of physical attraction and romantic chemistry. So you pick them out, you spend lots of time alone with them. And why? Well, because you want to explore romantic feelings with them, and you want to have fun. Those are your purposes for having these relationships. At which point you have to wonder, well, gee, what kind of fun are they going to be having during these relationships? And yeah, it's hindsight's 20/20, but this should have been obvious to everybody when you actually look at dating in a objective way. And it's very unsurprising now that dating has fallen by the wayside in favor of hooking up, because you already know what you're going to end up doing with your date eventually, as long as the date or dates go well. And the other thing is, you also know that the relationship has no future anyway, because you know that you are not planning to get married for another decade. And you have already resigned yourself to being in the cycle of falling in love, breaking up, falling in love, breaking up, falling in love, breaking up, over and over and over again until you're finally ready for marriage, according to the first imperative. So, yeah, when that's the reality that you've accepted, why not just cut to the chase and hook up and cut out a lot of the unnecessary drama of the rest of it? So those are the two imperatives that we received from our culture. And what did Christians do with these imperatives that we received? Well, we embraced them. And we just added a third, which is don't have sex until you're married. So yeah, don't get married till you're about 30. In the meantime, explore romance in meaningless relationships, but don't have sex. Which, and we should not be surprised that adding that third rule of don't have sex didn't really make a big difference in the outcome for anybody. Because no matter how well you put it, no matter how many purity rings you have to accompany it, it's basically like saying, hey, you should run straight at that concrete wall, head first, as fast as you can, without stopping. Oh, but don't hurt yourself. Yeah, if that works, it's a fluke. It's just not sensible. In the same way, sheer willpower is simply no match for the entirety of a person's biology and culture when it comes to resisting sexual temptations, specifically the sexual temptations that you are deliberately surrounding yourself with. And while the church has been saying that, the rest of our culture has been saying, oh, yeah, you run straight at that concrete wall as fast as you can without stopping, head first, but be sure to wear a helmet. Which, yeah, it's still stupid. That's still phenomenally stupid. But, honestly, that is marginally less stupid than what the church has been teaching. And we shouldn't be surprised that people have really realized that and been drawn much more to the culture's teaching than to the church's teaching on the subject. And it's ridiculously stupid what we've been saying, but it's not the biblical teaching. Again, go back to 1 Corinthians and the Apostle Paul. His command for those of us who are struggling with living celibately is to get married. He recognizes that not everybody has his gift. And so if you struggle with that, he says, yeah, it's better to marry than to burn. Get married. But the American church, instead of following the Apostle Paul's advice, we've gone right along with our culture in delaying marriage. And with doing absolutely nothing to help young people get into good marriages in the first place. We've pretty much just turned them loose and let them, hey, figure it out on your own. And that's true, even in purity culture, which, at least tried a little bit to do something different. But at the end of the day, they still accepted those two imperatives from our culture. Put off marriage until you're 30 and date in the meantime. And they modified that a little bit, but the purpose of the purity rings and the purpose of the pledges and the purpose of trying to do dating in a courtship kind of style was never really to be chaste. It was never really to reach marriage. The purpose of all that was to help you to be celibate while you continue to delay marriage until you're about 30. That was the whole point of purity culture. And yeah, they added a grab bag of additional imperatives. Oh, you shouldn't date, you should court, and all that stuff. But they left the fundamental problems untouched. Education and career are the big imperatives of our culture. But the church has rejected God's imperative of marriage so that we don't get in the way of what the culture considers to be more important. And if you want a case in point, consider a young woman I'm about to talk about, a former evangelical who grew up in this purity movement. And I'm picking on her because she wrote a book not too long ago, actually a few years ago now, about how she grew up in purity culture, and she wrote a book about how finally fornicating and losing her virginity, it brought her closer to God, and it made her a better Christian. And I'm going to put a link to her story in the description below. And just in case you're wondering, no, it did not make her a better Christian through repentance. Like, oh, I sinned grievously, but then I realized how grievous my sin was, and I repented, and I appreciate grace so much more now because I realized how bad I was in the first place. It's not that kind of transformation, being a better Christian. No, it's she became a better Christian by embracing her sin as a wonderful and godly thing, effectively calling God a liar every time he says that we should flee fornication, and he calls it impurity and says that it's a sin. So, in contrast to God, she described fornication as a sacrament, and that's her word. That's not me editorializing here. And it was wonderful because it just transformed her life. It liberated her from her outdated notions of right and wrong, which means the biblical notions of right and wrong. It made her more politically liberal. It made her more gay-affirming, less judgmental, which is interesting because she is ridiculously judgmental towards those of us who believe our religion is true. When it comes to conservative, Bible-believing Christians, she is extremely judgmental, but she still considers herself to be much less judgmental than she used to be. So her story, I'm quoting here, I graduated college with only one blind date under my belt, and then graduate school. And then I moved to Japan and started questioning my faith. Lots of little things that I thought were God's blessing, my job in Japan, my success in academics, were leading me nowhere fast. It wasn't so much that I was unhappy. It was that I felt totally abandoned and misled by this God I'd been told to believe. I'd done everything right. I'd been told my virginity and modesty and purity would be attractive to Christian men. And yet nothing was happening. Nothing was moving. Nothing was clear. And so long story short, she ends up giving up on purity and starts fornicating. And when she does, it's like this breath of fresh air for her. And so she is recommending it to others. And she felt betrayed because she had wanted to get married and she couldn't, even though she was doing everything that she was told. Marriage just wasn't happening. And on one hand, that's very, very understandable given purity culture, and I have a certain measure of sympathy for her. But on the other hand, there is a limit to the sympathy, because here's the thing. One blind date by the time college was over, that does not suggest a rigorous attempt to find a spouse. Okay, she was not looking that hard to find a husband. And that is a very, very sharp contrast to the way she treated her education and her career. Because you don't go through graduate school and move to the other side of the planet for a job without quite a bit of determination and quite a bit of effort. And she was trying very, very hard at her career and her education, just not at finding a husband. And the most ridiculous thing, and this is the real reason why my sympathy ends at a certain point, she thought that she was doing absolutely everything right when it came to finding a husband, when it came to becoming married, even though she relocated to Japan. Which, if you are looking for a Christian husband, demographically speaking, Japan is not exactly the best place to go about doing that. Christians are, I think, 2% of the population there, meaning 1% of the population being Christian males, meaning some subset of that is actually marriageable men. So, not a good move. It might have been mysterious to her why nothing was happening on the marriage front, but it's not exactly rocket science when you look at the situation she's putting herself in. She was not trying to get married. She was just expecting marriage to suddenly and spontaneously happen to her, while she focused on her education and career. She kept herself busy, trusting that her virginity and her modesty and her purity would somehow, draw suitors to her like a moth to a flame. And that's not a good perspective. That's a common perspective in purity culture, but it's not a true one. Because, virginity and modesty, those are attractive to men who are interested in marriage. But by themselves, that's not going to overcome this completely absent-minded approach to matrimony that is buried beneath career ambitions. Bare celibacy, which is what she was practicing and what she was taught, that does not usually lead to marriage. Much more often, celibacy is just a longer and more frustrating road to fornication. And for those of us who are not called to singleness, the virtue of chastity, it is not the same thing as mere abstinence from sex. Chastity is directing your sexuality towards fulfillment in a godly marriage. And no, you can't do that while you're fornicating. And so we're right to say, no, don't fornicate, wait to marriage. That is true. That is a biblical teaching. But at the same time, merely saying wait until marriage, that's not the same thing as being chaste. If you begin and end with no sex until marriage and just throw them to the wolves after that, all you're really doing is teaching celibacy. And the church needs to stop teaching celibacy and start teaching the virtue of chastity. Well, what exactly does that mean? That is what we're going to get into next time. So please like, comment, subscribe, share the videos, and join us next time when we finally define what we mean by the virtue of chastity.